Welcome. Police departments sometimes liken crime fighting to the game whack-a-mole. Hit crime in one place and it pops up in another. Hard to know where the next incident will take place. But in this age of big data, researchers have begun to help police predict where and when certain crimes will occur by crunching crime statistics and even analyzing Twitter. We'll get to that in a moment. Also on today's program, talking and not talking about race in the workplace, how we get diversity wrong, and in our public intellectual segment, where we examine research with the power to change our minds and public policy, we'll meet the researcher who showed grades going up and car accidents going down when high school starts later in the day. And towards the end of the hour, a history lesson about the Black Fives, African-American basketball, long before the NBA. First, though, predicting crime. If only it were as precise and effective as in the film Minority Report.
Okay, Jad, what's coming?
Double homicide, one male, one female. Killer's male, white, 40s.
Set up a perimeter and tell them we're en route.
I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks.
Give the man his hat.
Of course, there are no pre-crime squads or clairvoyant twins in real police departments. Yet, right now, police are using new methods of gathering and analyzing today's information to predict where crime might occur tomorrow. Professor Joel Kaplan couples our physical environment, streets, neighborhoods, with crime data in order to highlight areas with higher risk. He is the Associate Director of the Rutgers Center on Public Security. Matt Gerber, on the other hand, has turned his attention to the geotag back alleys of the virtual world of Twitter. Matt is at the University of Virginia's Predictive Technology Lab in Charlottesville and joins us via Skype. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Joel, what problem were you trying to solve? What question were you trying to answer?
We have a lot of crime data. We have a lot of administrative records. We have open source software and open source records. And the question is, how do we take all of this information that might be disparate from disparate sources, put it all together to provide actionable information? And that's really where we started this issue, this problem.
And you discovered that crime can be located in certain physical locations. Of course, police knew that, right? There are crime hotspots. That's not a new idea.
Right. So a hotspot tells you where to go. It tells you that there is an existing problem somewhere, and that problem is the clustering of crime. The next question is why? And what we do is we try to diagnose some of the underlying characteristics of crime hotspots so that police can begin to focus on the places that are attracting illegal behavior at these
And this
clusters.
is called risk terrain modeling.
That's right.
So you're modeling the terrain of a high-risk area.
Correct.
With factors like what?
With factors like proximity of schools or density of bars within a certain area or proximity of parks. And it's not these in isolation. It's how do all of these features of the landscape co-locate at certain places to create a unique context for crime.
The more bars, the more crime?
Not necessarily the more bars and not necessarily one or the other, but it's, you know, an ATM, for example, might increase your risk of robbery since it's easy access to money, but an ATM next to a drug market, next to a known gang territory, next to a park, might have a unique combination of factors that pose.
And in a minute, we're going to show some graphics that really illustrate this visually. But Matt, let me turn to you. How to use Twitter as a crime prevention measure?
Hi, Brian. I think, so you and Joel have set the stage perfectly, I think, for explaining our approach to it. In the same way that parks and bars correlate with the occurrence of crime, you can think about the virtual geographic surface of a city. So in the space of a park, not only do you have a park, but you have a lot of people, and they're tweeting about a lot of things. And the content of what they tweet about, what we found in our work, is that what they're saying also correlates with the occurrence of crime in the same way that ATMs might, or other things like bars. And so, for example, in a park, on some weekends you might have a lot of people just talking about typical park sorts of things. Whereas on other weekends, they might be talking about a large event that is going to occur or is occurring. And that's important information when it comes to identifying precursors for crime.
So how would a police department know that there are potential criminals to monitor their Twitter feeds and see if they're in a park or a playground or near a cluster of bars and using crime-sensitive words?
This is the common reaction to this work, in that it's how do you identify the criminals who are tweeting? We don't actually do that. We simply look at the complete picture of what everybody is talking about in an area and attempt to identify the leading indicators for crime. So we don't, in our work, attempt to differentiate at all between criminals and normal people. We're just looking for topics of discussion that are leading indicators that we find in the data.
But the technology exists that a police precinct could be monitoring all the tweets coming from a particular block in the neighborhood or something like that?
We can if the users in those areas have all signed up to have their tweets tagged with their location.
Aha.
So this is one limitation. We can't do this for anybody we want because it's an opt-in service. You have to opt in and say, I want all of my tweets to be GPS tagged. And
What
for those
potential
users,
criminal?
yes.
What potential criminal is going to do that?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that just gets back to the point of we're looking at what everyday people are talking about, and they're describing their routine activities, and it's these routine activities, and Joel can speak to this as well. It's these routine activities that take you into proximity of potential criminals or take you away from them, and that's what the work is latching onto.
Right. So some of the potential victims might be tweeting words that indicate a potential threat. Let's come back to Joel in the studio, and let's look at some graphics that indicate spatial clusters of facilities or other things that might indicate a high-risk area. So tell us what we're looking at.
So this is the analogy that we use to describe the RTM technique. And when crime clusters in certain places, we often refer to that as a crime cluster or a hotspot, and that's perhaps common verbiage to many law enforcement officers. But in a much more benign context, let's consider the analogy where you have a lot of children playing. If we focus only on the children and consider it kind of a hotspot of kids playing, we're missing the reason why. And if we zoom out from that focus and realize that there are swings and slides and open fields and other features of the environment that are attracting children to play at this location and not at others which are absent such entertaining features, then you get a better understanding of the reason for the attractive nature of the kids going to this area. And
That's the kids going to this area.
Exactly.
And then how does that relate to crime?
so what risk train modeling does is it does something similar in that it identifies the clusters of crime, the crime hotspots, and then diagnoses the reasons, the environmental characteristics of those locations that are attracting certain types of illegal behavior.
And I wonder if we can go back to the slide that was just up, where we saw the kids cluster in the upper left-hand corner. What are we looking at right below the kids?
So a focus on the kids is like focusing on crime incidents. But when we look at the environment where they play, we can see the reasons why they might be attracted
Oh,
to that
so that's the
location.
playground, where some
Exactly.
of those same kids might be, and the
Right.
grassy areas around the playground.
Right. So that's a benign context unrelated to crime. But when we look at crime, what we often do now is we focus on the clustering of crime, and our focus is on the crime itself and its location.
So in the upper right, we're seeing what?
A hotspot map of crime in a particular location. And what risk train modeling does is it diagnoses the environmental features that are common to the places where crime is occurring, so that our focus can be less on the crime incidents and more on the environments that are attracting the illegal behavior.
All right, let's go to the next graphic. And I think we're going to see the process of risk terrain modeling represented.
Right. So we, as potential victims and potential offenders, we all kind of have our mental maps of where crime, of where we might be most afraid, or where, if we were offenders, where we would most like to commit crime. And the cliche alleyway with poor lighting has two characteristics. It's an alleyway and it has poor lighting. And there's a lot of other features of the environment, like bars and schools and vacant properties and foreclosures. And when you take all these pieces together and you assess the correlation that these features have on the incidence of crime, you could begin to diagnose the spatial dynamics of illegal activity. And that allows us to focus less on the activity and more on the places.
So those different colored triangles in the top rectangle would be different inputs, some of those things that you were describing, clusters of bars, playgrounds, things like that.
Correct. The environment influences behavior.
And then you wind up with the map at the lower right.
Right.
And then public officials can use that, private citizens groups can use that to figure out where to put their attention of one type or another. It might be policing, it might be better school services as a longer-term goal,
Exactly.
after school.
Exactly. So the focus can be less on the people at these locations and more on the locations themselves.
And how about this layered graphic? What is
So this demonstrates kind of the conceptual framework behind RTM. Once we identify the risk factors that are attracting certain types of illegal behavior, we take all of those inputs, layer those different maps of those features together, and create this composite map which identifies places where all of these features co-locate and takes into account the weights of these features on the attraction of behavior.
So, Matt, let me ask you, as someone using Twitter toward a similar end, what do you think your two approaches have in common?
I think they have a lot in common, actually, and Joel and I have spent a lot of time recently talking on the phone just about how much in common they have. And so when he describes the characteristics of the physical environment and looking into the correlations between those and incidents of crime to identify areas and elements of the environment like lighting and alleyways that generate crime, we take the same sort of foundation to build our work on. Instead of looking at physical objects, though, we're looking at virtual objects that have a geographic location, like GPS tagged tweets. And so it's extremely similar. We're just looking at a different data type.
Where will you take your research next? Does it work in certain locations better than others? Is it better in urban environments than suburban environments? Or the more information you gather by monitoring tweets in different areas, how are you learning to finesse this?
Well, the best areas, and really the only areas that you can do this in, are areas where you have a very large Twitter-using population. The percentage of Twitter users who tag their tweets is relatively small. Probably only 3 to 5% of people do this in an area. So it takes a pretty large city with a large Twitter user base in order to pull this off. That said, there are a lot of locations in the United States and across the globe that have these. So in terms of where we want to take it location-wise, all big cities, all capital cities are really good candidates for this. And a result of the article and the a little bit of radio work that I've done resulting from this, we've got people like NYPD reaching out to us saying, hey, do you think we could do it here? My answer is we can try and see what happens and see if we get some results that are similar to the ones we got for Chicago. And then there's a long list of very technical algorithmic expansions and extensions that we'd like to make in order to improve the predictions. That's an obvious thing that we're always looking to do.
And Joel, your risk terrain modeling is being tried out in a number of cities, also including Chicago, right?
Yes, that's right.
And Newark.
That's right, yes. One of the things that I find interesting about the work that Matt is doing is that kind of both of us indirectly are trying to come up with ways that you can use readily accessible data that doesn't actually rely on either the crime to happen or the offender to be the one that volunteers to provide the GPS coordinates. And it's the combination of taking these public perceptions of spaces and combining them with characteristics of the environment that helps direct and focus attention rather than a blanket approach to certain places.
And in both your cases, signs being transmitted by the community rather than signs being transmitted by the individual potential criminal.
Exactly.
A fascinating way to help to begin to reduce crime around hotspots. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Up next, how to talk about race in the workplace. Are there racial tensions where you work? Do you really know? It's something we don't talk about much, and when we do, we sometimes make things worse. Our next guest suggests that the colorblind approach to fostering diversity is part of the problem. In an attempt to be fair, we treat each other as individuals when, they argue, we cannot be fully understood except as part of our racial or other group. So, how should we talk about race at work? With us, Hunter College professor Tamara Buckley and NYU professor Erica Foldy. Together they have written The Colorblind, Talking and Not Talking About Race at Work. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have this utopian notion, I think, of colorblind as the ideal. Is this wrong?
I think that it was a large step forward, especially in the 60s, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. But what we're concerned about and what we write about in the book is that it sort of masks elements of people that may be important. Race is important for many people. It's something that they draw on, that they have a sense of pride in. It also keeps inequities and inequalities sort of intact, because if we can't look at differences across race, then that sort of wipes out that conversation and that type of analysis.
And so how does that apply itself at work? How does it come up in the workplace? Give me an example from your book.
Oh, well, what happens in the book, we studied teams of child welfare workers. And we specifically went to study those teams because we thought, oh, if anyone's going to talk about race at work, it's child welfare, right? I mean, it's about the home, child rearing. Those are things that are understood to be culturally and racially informed. And we got there and we found out hardly anybody was even bringing it up. And there was really only one team that was able to talk about it. For the most part, teams, even if as individuals, team members felt like race matters and culture matters, even if they had some level of cultural competence as individuals, it didn't come up in the group itself, just because I think there's such a taboo about talking about race.
So you're advocating something you call color cognizance. How would that work, for example, in a team of child welfare workers?
Well, so color cognizance is basically the belief that race matters. It also recognizes, racism, institutional factors that impact people at work. And so we're arguing that if people can hold on to the belief that race matters and there's institutional racism, then that's a place to begin the conversation. So that's how we think about it.
So what needs to happen in a workplace environment? How do you get from the colorblind utopia, which it sounds like throws everybody into denial and silence, to color cognizance in a way that it sparks, significant and productive conversation?
Sure. What we were able to do through the research is identify what was different about this particular team that stood out among all the other teams that we looked at. And this particular team had a certain set of characteristics that all came together in one package. One is that there were at least a few people on the team who were color cognizant, who brought that sensibility into the group. But there were other teams where there were people who were color cognizant, and they didn't have conversations. So what was different about this team? What was different about the team was that there was a relative level of safety in the group. I mean, no work group is completely safe. It's not a therapy group, not a group of friends, but it's relatively safe. People felt like they could say things that were different from what other people said. They could be who they were. They could bring themselves to work. The other thing that stood out about this group is that they were really committed to learning and reflection about their work. Let's take race and ethnicity out of it for a second, but just in general, can they look at past work and decide if there were problems with it? Can they think about how to do it better? Could they resolve conflict productively? Those things all together seem to enable this team to talk and learn about race and ethnicity.
Give me an example. Tell me a story from that
sure.
positive group.
Sure. So lots of different examples. We opened the book with a description of a young man who was from a West African country. He and his family were refugees from a civil war. And he had been diagnosed with PTSD. He was living in a group home. He had become too much for his grandparents to handle. They were taking care of him. So the particular conversation, this young man who was about 14 would go up to people and would stand very close in front of them. And the team was trying to figure out whether Was this a sign of aggression? Was it a sign of PTSD? Was it perhaps a cultural norm? You know, cultures have very different senses of how close or far apart to stand. You know, interpersonal distance, that's a cultural factor. So they had a really interesting conversation trying to figure out what was going on with this young man. Ultimately, they decided they didn't really have the expertise themselves, and they decided to do a cultural evaluation.
Got another one?
So another one that comes to mind, because just to sort of piggyback on what Erica was saying, is that, so one of the things that we found is that there was more comfort talking about culture and ethnicity rather than race. So the case Erica was telling you about is more culture, and race, but one that comes to mind about race was there was an instance of a worker who was white and working with a Black American family and wanting to know about how much allowance this young person would need that he was working with. And in that instance, he was sort of seeking out guidance from his other teammates about, well, I don't know how much it costs to get a haircut in a Black barbershop. I don't know how much it costs or what types of hair products he needs. So it's a really basic conversation about different, norms around just hair and things like that. So those types of conversations are very helpful for people to learn and not feel like they had to know, because how would this person know? But he felt like he could talk with his teammates to get information.
And what's a conversation about culture, since you made that distinction? And so
Right.
that's easier,
Right.
as separate from race, because doesn't it all break down to different culture, different groups of people experience, rather than just their skin tone or their genetic, racial background, whatever you would
Right.
call it?
Well, so in this case, so the one I was talking about, I see the way that you're connecting them. When we talk about culture in the book specifically, we're often referring to people who have immigrated to the country. And so those conversations within the team are more about, well, there are language barriers, there are questions about, how comfortable this person is in this context. So they were more about immigration-related issues, often focusing on language.
I can give you an example that was clearly race-related. In one case, there was a client of color. She was in a drug abuse. Her kids had been taken away for the moment, and she was in a drug abuse treatment program. And the team members all felt that this particular woman was doing very well and was doing well with her parenting. And the people who ran the substance abuse program that she was in were very critical of her. And the team noted that she was a woman of color, that the entire program otherwise was completely white. The staff there and the other people who were a part of the program, and they wondered whether she was being treated in some discriminatory way. I have to say that's a conversation that would never have happened in the other teams. This team had a kind of a recognition of these issues, and again, the safety to talk about it.
You disclose in the book that the two of you sometimes disagreed
Right.
while putting the book together and doing your research. Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Sure, I'll start out, and I'm sure Tamara
Yeah,
will want to
chime
add
in.
something to it. So at one point, I was working on one chapter, and I wanted to make a big, bold statement. So and it's really kind of the basis of the book. I said, Americans are terrified to talk about race. I wanted to really put it out there. And I was looking at Tamara's comments, and she said, this seems like a generalization. My family talked about race all the time. I talk about race with my friends all the time. This doesn't reflect my experience. I thought, okay. So I wrote, most Americans are terrified to talk about race. And I thought that took care of it. And again, Tamara pushed back. And, it took a while, but I eventually realized that I was doing something that I think a lot of white people do, which is I was taking the experience of white Americans and putting it to stand in for all Americans. And, ironically, in a book that's all about bringing all these multiple voices into the conversation, I was actually shutting out other people from the conversation.
Yeah, and in that interaction, we realized that, so one of the comments I made in that discussion in the back and forth was that, I'm worried that if we stated in this way that most Americans, that we're going to lose our credibility. And when I said lose our credibility, I had a certain group of people in my mind, and I was thinking about Black people, and my mentors often who are Black. And so we realized along the way that we were really sort of holding different people in our heads in terms of who we felt accountable to, who we aligned with, who, like we had reams of data to read through over years. And, I tended to take the side or see the perspective of the people of color a little bit more maybe, and Erica might see. So there were many different ways, just even in terms of how we making sense of the data.
So you both learned from each other's life experiences and academic experiences.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that's a really important point that you're making, because one of the things that we think is important in our relationship together is that we do feel like we can learn from each other. We don't just make learning one way, that, you know, I'm a person of color and so Erica's only learning from me, but we're both learning from each other, and we think that that is important.
And were there any details on which you had to agree to disagree? Like you couldn't come to a unity of communication with your reading audience?
Well, we do say actually in the chapter where we talk about our conflict that even the conversation about most Americans, you know, we were able to come to language that we could both agree with. But I think we would still continue to wrestle a little bit about some of the details related to that.
Yeah, and I think another case that was sort of an ongoing source of friction between us, which was partially related to discipline, like you were saying. I'm a psychologist and Erica's an organizational person, but also related to just potentially our racial backgrounds, was what constitutes data. Like so we were looking for explicit conversations about race. So it had to be spoken, but a lot is not spoken, especially I think about that as a psychologist. And so
what kind of non-spoken data could you empirically plug in?
Right. Well, so there was one team in particular that we ended up labeling as color hostile, in the sense that there was sort of a team norm that made it acceptable for them to talk disparage in sort of negative terms about the affirmative action policies and practices of the group. And that team was primarily white, but there was a woman of color who was
Indian.
of Indian descent. And so we were sort of trying to find examples where she could state that she wasn't uncomfortable as they were having these really racist conversations, and even sort of when they would talk about diversity month, saying, we're going to put you in a sari, like really disparate. And I'm sitting here like, she has to be uncomfortable, but she wouldn't say it explicitly in those conversations. And so we would sort of look at the patterns of the data and if she got more silent, other ways, but that was an ongoing source of
So is
tension.
there a big takeaway for workplaces who are trying to manage diversity well, for certain kinds of diversity training or anything else?
Yeah, what I would say is what really sets our book apart from all sorts of other advice out there is that most of the advice around diversity is to focus on aspects of the organization that are very clearly diversity related. So look at affirmative action, look at whether you have diversity training going on. Those, those kinds of things are obviously race or diversity related. What we learned was that aspects of the organization or the work group that are much more broader. Are they generally safe? Are they generally able to learn? Are they generally able to productively resolve conflict? Those kinds of characteristics are as important as things that are more clearly race related.
Last word, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think another big takeaway is that, the sort of leaders of organizations need to model the behaviors that they're seeking from their employees, is one other thing. And just a final thing is, I think, customizing, if you want to do some diversity training in your workplace, it's good if you can talk about what's happening in your workplace that needs to be addressed, because then it can be more of a customized approach when someone comes in to do work.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your experiences and insights. I think people can learn a lot. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we hear about new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. For at least 20 years, advocates have been saying that high schools ought to start later in the morning. Yeah? Okay. Public intellectuals on high school starting. Okay. Should I thank them again?
Yes.
He says yes? Okay, sorry. I'll do a shorter thing and then we'll release you. All right, and we'll take that original.
5,
But
4, 3, 2.
well, thank you very much. I think people can learn a lot from this.
Thank you very much.
for having us.
Time now for Public Intellectual, where we hear about new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. For at least 20 years, advocates have been saying that high schools ought to start later in the morning to accommodate the sleep patterns of teenagers. Now, a new study builds on adolescent sleep research with data from schools that have actually tried starting later. The results show higher grades and other beneficial outcomes, including fewer car crashes. Two guests join us via Skype. The lead researcher, Kyla Wallstrom. She directs the Center for Applied Research and Education Improvement at the University of Minnesota. Also with us, Elizabeth Collins, assistant principal at Glens Falls High School in upstate New York in the Adirondacks. She spearheaded the shift to a later start time there. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. Hello from New York City. Professor Wallstrom, how did you approach this from a researcher's standpoint?
Well, you know, doing research in schools is always a challenge because there's so many variables that take place in every school, and every school is different. Even though you think a high school is a high school is a high school, but it's not. And so to collect the data, we collected data on over 9,000 kids in 8 high schools in 3 states. And we collected data on their grades and performance on tests, attendance and tardiness. And then we had all of the students complete the Teen Sleep Habits Survey, which asks questions about when they fall asleep, when they get up, what kind of activities do they engage in, how much time do they spend on homework, a variety of questions. That was the data gathered from the teenagers. And then, of course, we collected the car crash data as well.
Car crash data. So this
Yes.
is not just about doing better in school, not being crabby, things like that. You're talking about life and death from starting high school a little later?
Exactly. And you know, it's amazing because at the time that the study was funded, which was in 2009 from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, they were looking at the teenage sleep deficits as a public health issue and problem. And one of them, of course, had to do with substance use and abuse. And we did find clear linkage between the amount of sleep that kids get and their amount of substance use or risk for using substances. But then again, they're also looking at the car crash data. And 8 hours seems to be the tipping point for whether or not these students are engaging in risky behavior, including driving while sleeping.
You mean even on this schedule, there are any teens who actually get 8 hours of sleep?
Oh, yeah. In fact, we have a graphic here that shows that the teenagers in schools that start at 7:30, by and large, there's about 33% of the student body that gets at least 8 hours of sleep. And as the time change gets closer to 8:30 and 8:55, the percentage of kids getting 8 hours or more jumps to about 66%. So you go from about 1/3 to 2/3 of the student body getting at least 8 hours of sleep when you start school later.
So we see the different points on this graph being different high schools, and
Right.
basically depending on the start time, which is later as you go to the right,
Yes.
the number of hours of sleep goes up as you go up the graph. Pretty
Right.
self-evident and pretty much a straight line
Yeah.
showing a real call and response. Can I go back to substance abuse with you for a minute?
Sure. Yeah.
If students who get less sleep are engaging in more substance abuse, does that mean they're more likely to take speed or something like that?
Sure. I mean, we ask questions about drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and any other, and caffeine. And so any of those kinds of substances, kids who get less than 8 hours of sleep tend to make poorer choices. And so part of the choices has to do with the amount of pressure they would get from, say, their peers to be using and abusing. And so kids make healthier choices when they get 8 or more hours of sleep.
Assistant Principal Collins from Glens Falls. Did you see this? I don't know if you can measure substance abuse in your teens. This is presumably not taking place on school grounds in a measurable way. But tell us about that and other impacts that you were able to see from starting your school day later.
Well, much like Kyla was saying, we also surveyed our students at 2 different times and initially found that all of our students, or a majority of the students, were sleep deprived. And when they are sleep deprived, clearly their ability to focus in class was not as great. They were much more irritable. Our tardiness rate to school was increased. So there was, a greater discipline issues. And then when we did switch it, we're still in the process of 3 phases of our data collection, but after the first 2 phases, our students were getting up to 30 minutes more sleep a night, and our discipline write-ups have lessened. Our tardiness rate is not as severe as it was 2 years ago. And also another very important point is that the students also are failing fewer courses than they were. So it's definitely had a very positive impact on our student body.
I remember from my own high school days, and this is not a scientific measurement, this is just my memory of how I felt. I went to a high school in Queens that was so crowded that they had shifts. And in my sophomore year, I went from 10:20 to 4:20. And I remember being really happy during that year with that schedule. The next year, junior year, I was on the early shift and I was starting more like 7:20. And I remember that I was not nearly as happy with my schedule at that time. I don't remember whether it reflected in my grades or not, but I have a very clear memory of being happier as a result of the later schedule in sophomore year. Principal, assistant principal, why do you think the obstacle is money? You mentioned to me earlier that the reason that high school, in your case, may have been starting in the 7 o'clock hour rather than the 8 o'clock hour may have had something to do with money. Can you put your finger on that?
Not specifically. I know that just with budgets and planning, they, like a lot of schools with busing, because of transportation, they were starting kids earlier so that maybe they could have one group that goes to the high school, and then the second group, typically the elementary students, would start later, which really is backwards. Little kids typically wake up much earlier and are alert at an earlier hour. The big thing I think for high schools and why they also were starting them earlier was because of athletics. Teams to travel to different schools for your competitions, you wanted that travel time so that you could get your games in and try not to get the students back to their home school too late.
And Professor Wallstrom, is this what you're finding around the country? Is sports the big problem? Are parents the big problem? Are teachers' unions the big problem? Who would actually fight this? Because it seems to make so much common sense whenever we talk about it in the media.
Exactly. The findings, exactly what Elizabeth Collins is referring to, the sports issues are big. There's no question that in the 17 years that I've been looking at this and talking to coaches and teachers and kids, the sports issues can be felt to be insurmountable. But actually, as Elizabeth said, there can be accommodations made. You wouldn't want to have a traveling team, let's say for a sport, of 20 to 30 kids, basically dictating what the outcomes would be for sleep time for 1,500 kids in a school.
Is that because of daylight, that they would run out of daylight for the games?
To some degree, if you have a sport that needs a lighted field. However, the coaches have a pretty strong lobby. When they want to have 2.5 hours of practice, they basically have there's school board decision makers saying that, well, if we then start losing games, it's up to you. When in fact, we have actually found the coaches, once they've made the shift, are okay with it because the kids are remembering the plays better. And so there's actually been a change in thinking from the coaches once they've lived through a year's worth of coaching changes.
Did you have that experience in Glens Falls?
Definitely, Brian. I would say, I think changing the system is so personal for students and parents and teachers that they just think about their own world and how it's going to impact themselves. And definitely athletics was against it very strongly from the beginning. But as we've made the change, I think that it holds true that the athletes are performing, more well rested. So of course, if they're more well rested, they're going to be better athletes.
How about the teachers? Did they care one way or another?
We had a group of teachers that were very supportive. When we were making this change, we brought in all the key stakeholders with having teachers, parents, and students on our committee. But there certainly was a huge group that were against it. And again, it was more about, I think, their personal schedule than necessarily looking at what was best for the student.
Right. And parents similarly?
Parents and even the students. We had a large group of students that were against it. They even held a rally outside of school.
Really?
Protesting, yes.
I want to come to school at 7:30 in the morning.
Right.
That's not the student protest that I remember from high school.
No.
Why did they want that? They just wanted to get out earlier and have more time to hang out in the afternoon or do homework more leisurely?
Well, I think that was the key. Initially, they were thinking, oh, we're going to start later, but they didn't think about the fact that it would impact the afternoon and they would be at school later. So when they discovered that, they said, well, I really want to get out at 2:20. I don't want to get out at 3 o'clock.
So, Professor Wallstrom, maybe if you do a study that finds the sports teams from the schools that start later win more games, then you'll get national buy-in.
Perhaps. But, it's very interesting because we had the same issue with the students that Elizabeth is talking about. They want to hang out. They want more hangout time in the afternoon. That was clearly their wish. But we also queried kids 5 years after they made the change in Minneapolis. None of them wanted to go back and have to get up early again. So it's once they start to experience the change and how much better they feel, they actually found they could live with it.
So, Professor, are there national implications beyond high school from this kind of study? We know that we live in a nation that is sleep deprived. Right. I don't know if Glens Falls is the city that never sleeps, like New York. I doubt it. But, Professor Wallstrom, are there national implications beyond high school from this discussion?
I believe there are. And in fact, there is a movement now, even among the National Academy of Pediatrics, that part of this would be part of the parent education that pediatricians would give to parents about how the teenagers do have a sleep phase shift. This is a biological change that all young people, all teenagers in the world experience. And it isn't because these kids are lazy or because they are trying to be, obstreperous. They really cannot fall asleep before 11 p.m. That is part of their human biology. And as a result, this does have implications for schools across the nation when they are starting at 7 or 7:15. There's no way the kids are going to get 8 hours of sleep.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Good luck to both of you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
And that's Public Intellectual for today. I'm Brian Lehrer. March Madness wrapped up this week with just about nobody's brackets intact, marking the 75th year of NCAA championships. Now basketball fans give their full attention to the NBA. But did you know that for decades before the National Basketball Association saw its first black player in 1950, there was another world of basketball, the Black Fives era, a 50-year stretch of African-American organized basketball. Now the New York Historical Society recently opened a Black Fives exhibition. Here to share his thoughts and some images from the exhibit is Claude Johnson, founder and director of the Black Fives Foundation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Brian. Nice
Before we see some of the images, just give us a little bit of grounding in this, because there's a whole generation or two at this point thinking, wait a minute, basketball, that's a black thing.
That's right. Well, it wasn't always a black thing. It was invented in 1891, the sport, and by about 1904, that's the first time when African Americans on a wide-scale organized basis were introduced to the game by a man named Edwin Bancroft Henderson. He's known as the grandfather of black basketball, and actually last year he was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame for those contributions. So between about 1904 and 1950, there was a progression of more and more teams, first going from purely amateur, then to semi-pro, and then they developed a business model and became professionals, and it all culminated in ultimately in 1950 with the race barrier in the NBA falling down.
1950. That's 3 years after Jackie Robinson.
That's right. Yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, although that's the case with the NBA, there were plenty of instances prior to that where black and white teams and Jewish teams and Asian teams and others, different ethnicities, would collaborate and play together. So black teams were actually playing white teams prior to 1910.
So, New York Historical Society, lots of visuals.
Yes.
People can see. Let's put up one of those visuals, and maybe we'll tell most of your story as people are looking at some things. What is this poster?
Well, what this is an advertisement, a newspaper ad between two teams, the Alpha Physical Culture Club of New York City in Harlem. That was actually the first all-black athletic club formed in 1904. And the Monticello Athletic Association, or Athletic Club, which was in Pittsburgh. That was run by a man named Cumberland Posey Jr. And Cumberland Posey Jr. is actually in the Baseball Hall of Fame as a contributor because he later, after he played basketball, formed the Homestead Grays and was the architect of the Negro National League. So this is a game where at the Manhattan Casino, you'll recognize if you're an aficionado, 155th and 8th Avenue. That's
E-train stop.
Exactly, and that's the exact location of Rucker Park. And that used to be the location of a really famous ballroom where these teams played.
And a lot of street ball goes on today.
Exactly, a lot of street ball goes on, and you'll notice on that particular ad it said basketball and dance, and that's because almost all of these games included a musical element to it.
I also noticed it said the evening of December 25th, 1912. So first of all, 1912, I don't know if they had the D train yet, but Christmas.
That's right, it was Christmas Day, and that actually was the terminus for the 9th Avenue elevated train. 155th Street. It was catty corner from the Polo Grounds, and it was a very popular spot because of that train, and that's why that location was chosen by actually the two brothers, Eddie and Al Waldron, who were Jewish owners of a liquor store, but they created this magnificent ballroom at that location.
And who's this guy?
This is Edwin Bancroft Henderson, who's known as the grandfather of black basketball. He first introduced basketball in Washington, D.C. in 1904 to black students in the segregated public school system. He had learned the game in a summer course at Harvard University. He was a gym teacher. And when he came back, he realized there was an opportunity for black students to attract to this game, and he felt like it was going to be a hit.
Him and Jeremy Lin, the only two people to go to Harvard to learn how to play basketball.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well, and Barack Obama, maybe that's one of those guys. Yeah.
Is he black?
Yes, he's a very light-complexioned African-American, and at the time, I mean, as you know, there are many different hues in the African-American race, people of color, and yes.
Judging on this picture, he could pass if that was his intention.
That's right, that's right. And yeah, but he was one of the advocates, and after he left basketball, he actually was an advocate lifelong advocate for civil rights in Falls Church in Virginia.
What team is this?
This is the Alpha Physical Culture Club, which was featured in that advertisement, and also known as the Alpha Big Five. And again, they were the first all-black athletic club. The reason why these organizations were formed during that time at first was because of a need in the black community to build awareness about health care and health issues. At the time, after the migration to the north from the south of many rural and less educated African Americans, there was a tremendous mortality rate from pneumonia and tuberculosis. 25% of African Americans died from that, and it was thought that lung exercise would be the cure, when really it was just overcrowding in these tenements. Some of them had no windows and below grade, and so that was one solution, to have teams and exercise.
Women's teams too?
Yes, they had a custom of having sister teams. So this Alpha Physical Culture Club basketball team had a sister team called the New York Girls, and they're the first known all-black female team, and they won the New York area championship in 1910.
I see the ball, 1910 champions.
That's right, yeah, and Conrad Norman, the gentleman at the top, he's the coach, but he was also a player on that Alpha Physical Culture Club team, and his grandson came to that has come to our events as a descendant. We have a group of descendants that we represent and that we try to honor and celebrate.
Today, of course, no self-respecting women's team would allow themselves to be called the girls.
Yeah, but I guess they must have thought of, I don't know if they thought about it a long time or not, but it's definitely a catchy name.
They didn't call the men's team the boys, but that's
right.
That's another conversation.
Right. The New York boys, yes.
Renaissance Ballroom. The
So,
aristocrat of Harlem.
yeah, I mean, there's a beautiful, or formerly beautiful location, the Renaissance Ballroom at 138th and 7th. The shell of it is still there, and sadly so. There's really nothing being done with it. It's falling apart. But it's a historic location, fashionably located as the anchor of 7th Avenue that used to be called the Black Fifth Avenue because black families would promenade and get dressed up on Sundays. That's how you got to meet each other. There was no social networking at the time. And it was also the place where the New York Renaissance Big Five played their home basketball games under the ownership of Robert Bob Douglas, who's also in the Basketball Hall of Fame. And that's where they built their name, and they played all around the country and barnstormed and promoted that place.
Here's another team.
This is the Smart Set Athletic Club, the first fully organized, independent, all-black basketball team. They played out of Brooklyn, and they were important because they were a social club, and most of the members of this club were actually considered to be middle or upper class, in quotes, educated, professional black men and women. And Lena Horne's father was, for example, on this team and part of that family. Most of these players came from Bedford and Stuyvesant Heights. It used to be called, now it's Bedford Stuyvesant, but also Fort Greene and Park Slope and all around Brooklyn.
It's funny how the different teams have different looks.
Yes, and actually, so...
And I don't just mean the uniforms. Those last guys were all standing with their arms folded for the most part.
Yes.
This team, their aesthetic or whatever, they put their hands by the sides. Maybe it was just the photographer.
Well, those earlier photos were posed in studios. I mean, this is too, but it was a slightly different period. It was pre-World War I, and there was a certain pose that it seems like all teams struck. And this is more in the late 1930s, and it's a different period. And also, these are professionals now. So this is the New York Renaissance team with owner Bob Douglas in the inset.
And I think we're going to go on court for the next slide.
That's right. Most people believe that it was all just black teams playing black teams, but really there was a tremendous amount of collaboration between black teams, white teams, and others, all Jewish teams. And black and white teams were playing each other even before 1910. So it was nothing new when the Wrens, their nickname was the Wrens, started traveling around the country to places like Illinois, Wisconsin, even as far away as California to play. And they brought with them almost a mobile economy because wherever they went, the townspeople from all around would come to that place and either buy materials from local merchants or gamble, and they really, that's why they were well known and welcome.
Why do all these shots have players wearing knee pads? We don't see that in the NBA today.
What's interesting though, Brian, is actually knee pads and long socks and body armor are coming back and more and more. And the reason that you needed knee pads back then in particular was because the floors were so uneven. And a lot of times either they were uneven or they had flaws. They could have had nails, splinters, other defects in the flooring, and you never knew where you were going to be playing. So not to mention it was just a rough game back then.
Today it's smooth, smooth, smooth.
Yeah,
you could slip. It's so smooth and waxed.
I know. I mean, well, it's interesting. I mean, everything was different. Even the equipment. You know, we're going to probably see. I mean, if you look at the
set shots, no jumpers.
Exactly. That's right. The rules were a little bit different. But in this exhibition, we have almost 200 items that are of a whole variety of pieces, and one of them is a pair of shoes, basketball shoes from the 1910s. Which didn't have any rubber at all. I mean, it was just canvas and leather. So you can imagine everything was quite different.
There's
back
a
then.
pair.
Yeah, and these were hand sewn and handcrafted. I mean, Actually, these look like downtown hipster shoes that probably I would buy and wear with my jeans.
They look like bowling shoes.
They're a little bit like bowling shoes, that's right, yes.
So what do you want people to take away from this exhibit when they go to the New York Historical Society?
Well, thanks. I want people to really see that not only are there a huge number of items that's never been seen before, some of them are one of a kind or the only known one of their kind, but also there's a full narrative. So if you read every single label, you'll get taken through this journey, which didn't just start with the NBA. Most people think that when Sweetwater Clifton and Earl Lloyd and Chuck Cooper were hired in 1950, that was the beginning of black basketball. But actually, the history started 50 years earlier. And there was a progression, there were many lessons, and the pioneers from those times had to overcome many obstacles without any reference point. So what we look at as the Black Fives Foundation, as what we do, is we take that history and we say, well, if they did it, what was the essence of their success? And we use all this history to engage particularly youth, but also anyone, to bring people together, find common ground, and all be inspired by it.
For people who don't know, where is the New York Historical Society, and how long will this exhibit be running?
It's at West 77th and Central Park West, and it's open Tuesday through Saturday, and the exhibition is open through July 20th. So please go down there, check it out, and if you want, Brian, I'll give you a personal tour next time you're in the area.
Very nice offer, and we'll see if the Nets or the Knicks season can last anywhere even close to the weeks in the month prior to the closing of the exhibit. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much, Brian.
And that's our program for this week. You'll find a new show here each week at this hour, and do tune into my radio program weekday mornings 10 a.m. until noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, toward political pluralism in the Arab world. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.